Well, welcome everybody. I welcome each and every one of you. Thank you for all being here. Uh, it Bad weather always brings more people onto Zoom. I find out. So if I teach in the summer, it'll be me and Chris. The rest of you will be all outdoors doing something. But today, uh, this weekend is in my tradition is the baptism of the Lord, and last week was the Epiphany. So, knowing I was going to be talking this Saturday, I thought I wanted to reflect on that time between Epiphany, when Jesus is a baby, and now he's grown up. And I just keep coming up with things. For instance, one of his issues is just the opposite of ours. Oh, one of our faults, or the faults of some of us, is all we ever do is think about ourselves. Well, the rest of the world doesn't think about us at all. And this causes a great deal of problems if you're that kind of a person, because you get resentful and judgmental and whining that you're not the center of the universe. And we say that the spiritual life is to become less self focused and more focused on others. Uh, John the Baptist, when Jesus came along uh, to John's realm, John was front and center. He was doing these baptisms. People were coming to him out in the desert. He was a prophetic figure, no competition. Uh, and then Jesus comes along. Well, John has it right. He says, I must decrease and he must increase. And that really is a spiritual condition, which is why so many of us are encouraged to have some contemplative life, because one of the things you do in a deeper prayer is you stop thinking, you stop focusing on thinking about yourself. Your mind does what it does, but you don't pay it attention, so that you can open yourself to the presence that's there, the holy, the ultimate reality, God, as I would call this energy, this source. But as long as I'm thinking only about me, not going to happen. Well, Jesus is kind of on the opposite track, if you will. He starts out as not much. I mean, there's probably some issues about his the marital status of his mother at the time of his conception, and so there probably were a few questions in the little village about how legit he is, as we would say today. So there was probably some of that going on as he's growing up. But he's a carpenter, and he does whatever jobs he can get. But when you think about it, if there was some issues about him, his birth, he probably would have a little trouble getting work locally, and he might have to travel out a little bit to find work. We don't know that, but I suspect his upbringing wasn't hunky dory. But he was a carpenter, and he had a trade. Now, we think of carpenters as people who go into workshops and deal with wood, but he did a lot of other things. He fixed things like doors and helped build houses and repair houses. And in harvest season, he went out to help in the harvest, which of course gives you the idea of a lot of his parables about how things grow, and you plant the seed and it grows on its own, and you build houses on rock, not on sand. I mean, these all came out of his own personal experience in trying to make a living. So he's not a very important figure outside of his family. You know, he might have brothers and sisters and so on, siblings. I always hoped that he did, because I would feel that his humanity would be much fuller if he had to deal with siblings. Nowadays, so many families are single child families, so you don't quite have that dynamic, but us older people, most of us were brought up with siblings, and we are a product of uh, those relationships in many ways. So, but if he didn't have them, they were still living close to other relatives in compounds in Little Nazareth. So he wasn't a central figure, but something was going on in him that would get him to come out of the daily life of everybody else, let's say, and go off by himself. Now, we often say to the desert, or he would go out in the evening or the nighttime, probably not too far away because there's a lot of animals out there and other critters. But he'd go off by himself to be by himself. So he had a sense of himself that at some point was going to counter how disinterested other people might have been in him. And I think out of this silent prayer, he realized that his importance was not himself, but his importance was the mission that he was trying to proclaim. Well, he had to figure out, what is this mission that he's trying to proclaim? Well, he had the rabbis, and he had the government, which was the Roman government, and the tax collectors in Nazareth who worked for them. And they had various messages of what the world was all about. And his time by himself, of course, he was reading. He had scriptures to read, such as Isaiah, and proclaiming, something's coming, something's coming. And his sense was something is here in our midst. And in his relationship with God, he had a sense of it very, very personal and very intimate. And he came up with the term Father. Now, when he went, so he might have been doing some things in Galilee. He might have been gathering together some friends. One of the things he might have done is gone out on fishing boats as well to help out at different times. In other words, you're trying to find a way to make a living. And so he might have gone out on fishing boats because you don't always have work in carpentry or building or whatever. So he might have helped some of these people. They might have been his very relatives. But so he knew something, I think, about fishing, casting nets. That was another of his parables. So I don't think he was just a guy who watched things. I think he participated in the very things that became his parables, his stories. So he might have been doing something. He might have been gathering a few people around him who were uplifted by his ideas that the kingdom of God is now here in our midst. And it's specifically for the poor, the outcast, the one about whom people pay no attention. Remember, he might have been someone who grew up without people paying attention. And he felt that God, who he called Father, paid attention. And this kingdom was especially for those who were on the outs with the religious officials who looked down their noses at sinners, and the government who couldn't care less about the poor. So it was good news for people, especially if they saw him doing some healings. When he went to Cana nearby for the wedding, in John's gospel, that was the first of his miracles. And John has nothing about Jesus being baptized. It seems they couldn't care less, John, in his gospel. But so at some point, Jesus, he was going to the temple now and again. I mean, for his, maybe not annually, but frequently enough for the Passover. And of course, when he went there at 12, that story that we get of Jesus being found in the temple, he's an adolescent at that age. But So he doesn't quite have it together. His sense that God is his father, and people tell you, well, God's house is the temple in Jerusalem. So he wants to be in God's house. So when he goes with his parents, he stays there because he has this sense of the Father God and he wants to be in his house. But it's an adolescent spirituality. He grows from that to realize that this presence that he calls Father is in our midst. You don't have to go to Jerusalem. And of course, I see any number of people who feel they have to get up and go someplace to find Jesus. Christians, I got to go to church and look at the tabernacle because that's where Jesus is. And the Catholic Church encourages that, saying he's especially the real presence, especially in the host. I don't deny that. But what you lose from that, if you don't keep it balanced, is in the midst. And you're in the midst, so that his presence is within as well as in our midst, so that it's a connectivity presence, if you will. It's not out there and I'm here without it, and then I have to go out there or in there to get it. So this is what Jesus is beginning to develop as he grows up. And when he goes to see John the Baptist, John's kind of fire and brimstone, separating the chaff from the wheat. And if you're chaff, you're blown away, you're nothing. You're going to get it. And if you're wheat, you're fine. It's black and white. And a lot of it is, moral issues that people say, what am I supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to care for the poor and don't hoard and so on and so forth. Well, this is all stuff that they had in Jewish religion. It wasn't new stuff. John is just reminding them, well, you're supposed to do it. And then you'll be fine. But it's a little bit of fire and brimstone. And Jesus is not that way. He feels that this God is loving, as John's gospel says. And where did John get that? He must have gotten it from Jesus' manner and way. God is love. God is not judgment. And of course, in my Catholic Church, that's always an intention. Not intention. There's always a tension between God as judge and God is completely loving. And I tend to lean on the God is complete love and not so much judgment, but that's from my own personal experience and readings that have attracted me. So Jesus is moving in that direction of God is for everybody, but especially for the poor and the outcast. Simply God is for you. God cares about you. Not that he doesn't care about, I say he, it could be whatever pronoun you want to use just to make a sentence, but God is for everyone, but a special reminder for those who think God is least for them. So highfalutin religious officials think, well, God's already for me. And Jesus says, well, a lot of you are hypocrites. And so that was his experience of the government and his experience of rich people and his experience of the religious officials. A lot of them. He just, Lazarus at the door of the rich fellow who was a rich Jew, as far as we know from the story. So Jesus is growing gradually into his message, and then he proclaims it. But notice how different this is from what a lot of your official religious leaders are. They go to seminaries and they get taught. And then they go out and they teach you what they've been told. I know that. I went to seminary. It's not as if I was any different. And I started out teaching what they told me until I realized people weren't interested in that. They wanted to find God. And it took a few years. People had to train me in what their needs were. I learned to be a priest from the people, not from the seminary. But I didn't know that. So Jesus is gradually learning the message by his meditations, his prayer, and his life experience. So he doesn't sit around talking theology. He talks his life experience, which is his parable, and he talks of his personal relationship with God, as he calls Father, and that's why he expresses what he expresses the way he expresses it. And so at some point he comes to John, and he's probably a bit of a follower of John for a while as he's getting his message together, because John is talking about the kingdom. Jesus has a different thing on it. And John's the kind of guy who goes after Herod and his wife. He's right out there. He's political as can be. Jesus doesn't quite do that, but he gets crucified anyway, In other words, you go against power, they're going to get you in the end. But that doesn't diminish the kingdom of God, such as resurrection. It came out of all that. When you think about it, a lot of Jesus' message is about justice, and his own death is ultimate justice, because no matter how much money you have, everybody dies. Death is death. You're all the same at death, whether you're rich or poor. So there's a lot of leveling out with death, but with Jesus came resurrection, and the promise of it for us. Now, another thing looking at is the Magi, which was last week, and Jesus is, as it's depicted, he's still a baby. And they come and they worship him. As a matter of fact, we've just sort of clumped it all together. They come to the stable or the cave, and the shepherds are there, and the animals, and these three guys. There's three. It's because there's three gifts, which is metaphorical. And one of the things that strikes me about them, besides searchers, they're searchers, which aren't we all who are trying to grow spiritually. And they're following the signs that they experience. In other words, they're following their experience. They're not following their theology. Now, these guys say they came from Persia. Persia had some sort of religion. Of course it did. The Persians. So they had a thing, intellectual stuff, and had some experience with it. But now something new came along. Metaphorically, it's the star. Maybe there was a real star, or a couple of planets come close together. Who knows? Whatever it is, what it's trying to say is they have an experience that doesn't quite fit in with everything else, and they decide to follow their experience. Well, I bet there's a whole lot of people who said, you guys are nuts. As they'll say to you, those who are living within an acceptable circle of theological and doctrinal truths, as they would call them, have big problems with people who follow their experience. So especially it's a spiritual experience. So I suspect these guys were following some spiritual depth that said, let's pursue this. Let's see where it goes. And they don't know. So there's not security and certainty, but there's trust and hope. Great things to be needed. Anybody who wants a religion that is all truth and everybody else is wrong, they're not about trust or hope. They're about certainty. And that's not the spiritual life. It's always a little bit edgy as you get more into the contemplative. So they follow their experience, which in this case is the star. And they are central people for about one chapter, maybe half a chapter. And then you say, wonder what happened to them. Well, that's the point. They disappear. And I go back to what John said. I must decrease and he must increase. And I think this is a point for all of us. At some points in our life, we are very significant and very important to a lot of people. But as we move on with our spiritual growth, we may become much less significant and important to those same people. I think of my own life up here, and I used to work a lot in Boulder at a particular parish there, and I only lived up here 3 months a year in the summertime. So a lot of the rest of the time I was there, or some in San Francisco. Well, when I was in Boulder, for a good deal of the time at that parish, I was very significant, very important to a lot of people. They'd asked me to do weddings, funerals, baptisms, so on and so forth. Got a lot of masses, and in a sense, I was kind of full of myself. I thought, I'm a pretty important guy. I'm not anymore. The number of Christmas cards I got from that parish this year is, and it's not I've forgotten. It's just they've moved on. I'm not that central in their life anymore. But I'm following a path and an experience that means I'm going to become less. And someone else is going to be. So spotlight's on some other priest down there. What do I know? What do I care? The important thing is that you're growing spiritually, and that sometimes you're not going to be significant in people's lives. And that's okay. That's sort of John the Baptist. And what's important is that Jesus is significant in my tradition. Jesus is significant in my life, such that those around me might experience something of my faith, something of Christ's presence because of the way I act, which means to be of service to others, which means thinking less about me and more about them. So the Magi think more about Jesus than of themselves. They're going out of their way for this King of the Jews. And then they disappear. They've done their job. They're gone. And I think, just keep that in mind when in the ups and downs of your own life. And another thing that I want to look at, I haven't even looked at my notes yet. I'm just thinking of some things, is how come you never see Joseph holding the baby? Actually, I did see one. Somebody sent me a Facebook. I think it was a painting, but it might have actually been a creche scene. And Mary is sleeping, which is, what a mother might need to do once in a while. And she's sleeping, and Joseph is holding the infant, which I thought was very significant. It's as if we're so much hung up on the virgin birth that Joseph is, tossed aside, except when he has to do the heavy lifting of moving from one place to the other, taking care of his family on the run to Egypt, that sort of stuff. But I think of Joseph very much in the scene. Two things come to me about the creche that I don't think is very helpful to, let's say, growth of babies. Jesus is not held. The little baby's wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a feed bin. Okay, the feed bin was this cradle. That's the best they could do. That's fine. They put some straw down. And the swaddling clothes is to keep him from rolling around and hurting himself, and so that he'd be quiet and get some sleep. But you don't see anybody holding him. Everybody's worshiping him. Babies don't want to be worshiped. Babies want to be held. I think it's very important. My sense is very important to be held, to feel human touch. I mean, the baby's just spent 9 months experiencing, person, and now it's out there all on its own. So I much prefer creche scenes in which somebody's holding the baby Jesus. Now, of course, later on, you see Mary holding Jesus, but he hardly looks like a baby. He looks like a grown-up adult sometimes in a baby's body. But they're all doing theology. I'm doing psychology. And I just like to see the baby held a little bit more. And I bet Joseph held that kid, as well as did Mary, because he grew up being a very loving person. In tomorrow's reading, which is the baptism of the Lord, if it's Isaiah chapter 40, it talks about making a straight highway. in the wasteland. Said, make a straight highway in the wasteland. The Lord is coming. Well, I think of that as the wasteland. It struck me as your empty center, but it's not empty. But if you can, what we're trying to do in a contemplative practice is stop paying attention to ourselves and stop all our thoughts. Because what our thoughts do is they furnish our life, if you will. They're busy, there's lots of them, and they furnish our lives. And what we want is more of a wasteland, an unfurnished absence of. And so what we're trying to do is let go of our thoughts, all the other stuff that goes with them, the emotional life and so on, and just not pay attention to it so that we can open ourselves to the emptiness, which in a metaphor is a wasteland because there's nothing there, but God is there. And I think that's what it's saying. They said, make a highway. In other words, allow God to not have to come around all your thoughts and push them away or battle with them or compete with your thoughts, and you're thinking about yourself all the time, whatever it is, your plans, your worries, your fears. You might have plans, worries, and fears that are real. People lost their homes in Boulder. They got a lot of worries. But what you're trying to do a little bit of the day is not pay attention to them. And that makes a straight highway in your wilderness. And then you discover what? Oh, God is in your midst, which is what Jesus said. The kingdom of God is in your midst. I think right from the get-go, the first reading tomorrow, I believe it's going to be Isaiah 40. You get a choice on the first reading. It could be Isaiah 42, but I think it's going to be Isaiah 40. So I think that's what Jesus is trying to do. So the so-called silent years, they're not really silent at all. They're just not written about very much. But they're the bedrock of Jesus coming to a realization, little by little, of himself. And now he's going to become a center of attention. And this is going to be however long his public ministry is. And before that, his private ministry, before they started writing about it, is he's becoming the center of attention, in part because of his miracles, and in part because of how he's so uplifting to the forgotten, the ignored, the condemned, the judged. And he's drawing people to himself. And as he does that, he's trying to not make himself the center of attention. I mean, the emperor, the Caesar, thought he was a god, or liked the idea of thinking of himself as a god, because then he thought he'd have more power, people pay more attention to him. Jesus is trying to do anything but that. So as much as we talk about hypostatic union, the divine and the human, Jesus in this time between Epiphany and baptism is attracting people to himself while trying to get the message to be the center. The kingdom is in your midst. God loves you. He didn't say very much at all, I'm going to make it happen. So he's not that kind of guy. And that's not the way he sees things. So he's working counter to his public image now and again. And I think it's more in John's gospel, the very contemplative one. The Son of God refers to himself as the Son of Man, or it seems like he is, which is an important figure in Hebrew scriptures. But most of the time, he's not trying to focus on himself when he says to people, and I suspect he was doing some miracles before he came to John, because as it says, John the Baptist, because as it says in, I think it's John's gospel, no, I forget, I think it's Luke's gospel, where he gets baptized by John. And then suddenly people are coming to him. Probably he was doing some things in Galilee before he came to John. Because John thought he was a pretty big deal already. And remember, they were cousins. So it's not as if he was a perfect stranger. It's only 90 miles from Nazareth to Jerusalem. One can do those things and visit with your cousin, especially as a kid, before John goes off into the desert to do his thing. So even John is making Jesus important, but Jesus is trying to make the message important. And I think we have to keep that in mind whenever we're doing a ministry in contemplative practice, which I think the Knoxville group of SOS is trying to do, is the attention is not on you, the teacher. The attention is on the message. And the message, I think, for someone like me in my tradition, is what I've been saying. The kingdom is in your midst, which means it's within you, around you, and among you. And you've got to get out of the way a little bit, thinking about yourself all the time, so that you can experience it and that other people can experience it through your being of service to them. Now, what do we mean by service? I think Jesus was a lot of service to his family. For sure, he was the oldest child, okay? If you have brothers and sisters, he's the oldest boy. And that's a lot of responsibility. So he has to be kind of living out this growing idea of kingdom in your midst in his family, in the way he serves them, loves them. And, he doesn't leave till he's 30-ish. People say, why did he take so long? Well, maybe because the other siblings or cousins or whatever weren't quite ready to take over the role of support, financial support of the family. He didn't want to leave them high and dry. So a lot of your ministry is to the world you're already in. It's not so much, well, I got to get out of here and do something to save the world. Well, I suppose. I don't think so. I mean, maybe some of us, but by and large, how about the people you live with? Or not just the people you live with. How about your animals? Yeah, you got Teresa out there now in North Carolina. They got all the snow out there. She lives in, used to live in civilized Knoxville. Now she lives in, Western North Carolina. But she takes care of those animals, those horses. They got to have some food. We have horses out there, and they'll eat everything. And when they finish eating everything, you got to give them some more to eat. So they eat most of the day and sleep a little. And you got to love them. If you had a person you were living with that slept most of the day, that slept a little and ate a lot, you'd probably be upset. So you really got to have a lot of patience for animals. Any case. So you live the message. Let's start living the message around your house. Then you can start saving the world. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think Jesus kept it in mind when he went public. They still thought he was crazy because they got used to him doing it all. And at some point he just said, I'm out of here. He kept going back, but you notice he went back. He lived in Capernaum more than he lived in Nazareth. I mean, but he really was on the road with no place to lay his head. But that wasn't until after he had done his job for his family, if you will. There is, I think, for a lot of us, there is, and I suspect Jesus had to deal with this, a kind of a wall. And a wall I use this metaphor. You come up against something and you seem like you can't get past it. And you can't get past it by forcing it. It's not one of these things, I'll pray harder. I'll do more. Because then it's all your action and it's not grace. But the wall is, in your spiritual development, is to remind you you're not in charge. and you really don't have any power. God's in charge, and God's got all the power, and God's going to work at God's pace. I mean, look at Jesus, he was 30 before he got on the road. So it wasn't as if he was resisting God. It's all timing. And so the wall says you gotta let it happen, but not walk away from it. And I think the way we let it happen is to be in silence. One of the things I've just, and I think that's a bit about going into the desert for Jesus, is you want to find the silence. You know, they sleep with their animals. You know, we have this sense that we sleep in our house and we put our animals out someplace, like in a barn or a shed or a pasture. They're out there, I'm in here. But that's not how they lived in Nazareth. They all lived amongst one another, and that's just the way it is. So if you want to find some silence, you can't tell your rooster shut up. Um, you have to go someplace where the animals aren't, at least the ones that are making a lot of noise, and so you get away from town, so to speak, or what we call the desert. Our silence, or places of silence, both within and around us, that's kind of our desert. Uh, and what I have discovered is the presence, the ultimate reality, the power, God, in the silence. Now, is God the silence? Well, no, but the experience is, as I experience silence, I experience the presence, and my eyes are closed. Jesus went out in the desert in the evening or night. So not only was it silent, it was dark. And those two things, you stop talking and stop looking at stuff and stop paying attention to your thoughts, you'll come up against this wall. And a lot of people say, what's the purpose? Well, the wall is part of the journey. And then suddenly, for me, suddenly in that experience of darkness and no sound, and boy, let me tell you, this monastery, there is no sound. Because the only animal living here is a cat. And our cat sleeps most of the time, in the winter anyway, and sleeps downstairs in a nice warm room that has a lot of furnace pipes to it. So she's a pretty happy cat. But I think it's in that way. So I'm suggesting that Jesus as well is understanding the intimacy of God within himself, so he can be so certain to tell others. His message is really his own personal experience of God and God's care for the poor. When he goes out, and this is jumping ahead a little, hopefully I'll give some Lenten talks. When he goes out into the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, it's not about himself. It's about the people, about who is the blessed. And it's often just the opposite of what you think. And when he teaches from that, it's often telling people how they can live with one another. Turn the other cheek. If you have two cloaks, give one away, and so on and so forth. But it's all about the other. It's all about building relationships with the other. But you don't get to that radical place of building relationship. You got two cloaks, give one away, turn the other cheek. It's pretty radical. You don't get there without going through that wall to that sort of certainty that God is with you. And then whatever message comes from that is the message that you'll live out in your life, which may not be the same message you'll get from the pulpit, because a lot of pulpits are political or theological or dogmatic. Okay, but Jesus is something else, and it comes from his own personal experience. So he goes through that wall, and then that brings him to his decision. And his decision is be of service in proclaiming the message. The kingdom of God is in your midst. So he's not going to be a political Messiah. So you don't hear a lot of Messiah talk. And when he heals people, he says, don't tell anybody, because they're going to jump to conclusions. I mean, John the Baptist, well, a lot of his talking is out of John's gospel, and making Jesus a big deal. Because by the time John writes his gospel, they've made Jesus too little a deal. And John says, oh, we got to pump this back up. So a lot of divinity stuff is thrown in there. But we have trouble relating to a divine person. But we don't have trouble relating to Jesus as a human person filled with the divine in a way that none of us are. Or if we would respect the divinity that is within us, we'd be much more like Jesus. So he's not going to be a political Messiah, and he's not going to be a judgmental person. So his path is not John the Baptist's path. What's his path? Love. That's his path. He's much more tribal than other people. What I mean is tribal. Tribe means you bring together in a bond in which one is committed to the other. And even if there's a hierarchy, one is committed to the other in the tribe. And Jesus feels the tribe is the whole human condition, everybody. And you can even see it in the Gospels, how he goes from just ministering to his people, which would be the Jews, to the Gentiles. And of course, Paul picks this up. Paul is a well-educated Jew, gradually moves into this sense of tribalness is the world tribe. So Jesus' experience of love is expanding in his work. So what I'm suggesting is part of your doing the work of God is doing work on yourself, like he did in Nazareth, going out and supporting his family, trying to be a good son, going out to the desert, experiences, and that was building him up. And then his work, how he expressed what he was experiencing in his prayer life. Both those things will build you up, but you got to have a base, and you got to have a strong base. Otherwise, your ministry is going to be just egocentric. I know, been there, done that, and I don't want to make it too much like that anymore. I get tempted, but so as his message of love expands to the love of all, not just to the love of your local tribe, the love of all. And this, I think, is what allows him to move out from being so family focused economically to realize he needs to be more. But first, he was family focused economically. So he's going to move beyond the family, beyond family labor. And he has to have some hope that overcomes his fears that they won't be taken care of. And not only are they taken care of, but some of them start following him. Some of his relatives, I'm sure, and other friends would follow him and become supportive of him. So he has silence, realizes the relationship with God, who he calls Father, and that moves him on. So you have to ask, I think, yourself now, as he goes out into his ministry, what's his purpose? Is it to make money? Is it to be famous? Now, I know when I teach, I need to make some money. And I ask you people for your support so I can pay my bills and help support the Flawless Fathers whatever way I can. But if it were more than that, that wouldn't be good. Or if I wanted to be famous, that wouldn't be good. So I'm not famous. But so why do I do it? And one of the reasons, and someone suggested this for themselves, and I grabbed me, to teach is to breathe. In other words, the work you do has to be life-giving to yourself, or it's not going to be life-giving to anybody else. So you might, you know, think of Dorothy Day for the moment. Um, and servant of God, I believe she's now called Dorothy Day. That's on the way to sainthood. The first thing is servant of God. So you think she did it as a great miserable sacrifice for these wretched poor people? No, it was the very breath of her life. Did she have days when she felt like, I don't want to do this? Of course, because she's a human being. You're not God. But overall, you do a work because it's the very breath of your life. You think of and you go back to your families, children, spouses, or whoever else you take care of in your family circle, your home circle. It has to have something to do with the very breath of life. Otherwise, you're going to do it as a miserable person, and everybody will pick up that you're miserable, and they would rather you just left them alone than that you be such have such a lousy attitude about it all. Um, so, nobody really likes, unless they're super desperate, nobody really likes to be helped by someone who doesn't really want to help them or who has judged them. So it has to have something to do with the breath of life. So at some point, of course, in Jesus' own spirituality, God is going to become an abyss. And Jesus must throw himself into that abyss. And I think that's going to come to all of us. We think that Jesus going out in those so-called silent years, going out into the desert must have been just so wonderful. I mean, he's God. He's a human being also. He has to have these human emotions, this human spiritual growth to discover his divinity, if you will. We all have to discover the divine within us, and I think some of it is the abyss. And you get a little bit of that right at the end of his life, which I'll talk a little bit about more in Lent, I hope, is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Has God forsaken him? Well, we say no, God didn't forsake him. But that was Jesus' experience. And we try to hold on to that when our own experience is, God, you have abandoned me. You're sitting in your house on a Wednesday afternoon and it's fine, and suddenly the whole thing burns down in about 1 hour. Smithereens. My God, why have you abandoned me? And of course, I'm sure any number of people from those boulder fires will stop going to church, reinforce their sense that there is no God, and so on and so forth, because that's where their spiritual life is. Disaster happens, God doesn't care because God's not supposed to let disaster happen. Well, Jesus is supposed to be God, and he's dying on a cross. That's disaster. And it happens pretty quickly. So his experience is the same experience. My God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, now he's in the abyss. What's his response to the abyss? Into your hands I commend my spirit. That is the ultimate response. You think he could have done that as a 12-year-old or maybe even a 15 or 20-year-old? But he was able to do it when he needed to be able to do it. And so hopefully we'll all be able to do that. Into your hands I commend my spirit. When my experience is of the abyss, and the trust is that you're really there. So think of yourself in your own contemplative prayer, and you're sitting there, and you're like Teresa of Calcutta. Nothing's going on. It's complete emptiness. God has abandoned me. That was her experience, but she didn't buy into it. She got up anyway, And she took care of those dying babies and lepers and all the other people nobody cared about. And that was Jesus' message. God is about all those people nobody cares about. So how about you being caring about all those people nobody else cares about? Is one of the things Mother Teresa said, yeah, this is what the gospel means to me. And so it got her going on the whole thing. Uh, so you've got to be able to deal with that abandoned me part of your silence. Uh, and I think now at 9:25, you've been sitting long enough. So again, support me on Venmo through Terry-Ryan-25, or send a check here to the monastery, and we'll put that up so I can pay all the bills that have come due this year. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a break till 9:30. It's 9:24. None of us have to go that far to the bathroom. 9:30. Then we'll come back, and Mary or somebody else is going to have the gong, and we're going to do a 20-minute meditation, then a little Q&A, and maybe I'll have one or two things to say. I've actually got a lot more on this that I'd like to talk about, but we just sort of ran out of time. And I don't know if I'm working for you in February or not. But so now let's take our time off, and we'll come back at 9:30. Okay, Chris?
We'll be back at 9:30, and I'll put all that information on the chat.
Thank you. Okay, well, welcome back on my computer time, which is 11:30 East Coast time, 9:30 Mountain time. And some of you come from far and wide, and there was a little something in chat about SOS. Searches of Silence is what it stands for. And it's an organization started out of Knoxville. And what they try to do is through ecumenical and interfaith talks and discussions to help people to grow in the contemplative journey. So I think it's so they as well ask for your support if you can, because two important things are happening. They're trying to share their experience, and they're trying to do it ecumenically and interfaith. The belief that the contemplative journey crosses all paths and has a connection for all of us. So I kind of keep that in mind. And speaking about that, as you're coming back into the room, one of the things I remember about the Seekers of Silence group when we used to get together is, and this shows that my spiritual immaturity is it's not about the prayer or the people. It's about the cookies that Ghislaine Miller used to get. And sometimes I'd say, I got to teach because I want those cookies. I don't see those cookies anymore, except when I used to go there. And you might say, well, you can get them online. It's not the same. If I get them online, it's just gluttony. It's all about me. But if Ghislaine was to send them through Santa, I receive them with love, you see, and that would challenge me to be a more loving person as I'm eating my cookies. So these are the things I think about, just so you know I'm not too perfect. Now, to get back to something less important than my cookies is the spiritual practice. We're going to take 20 minutes. Who's the gong lady?
Mary.
Okay, Mary, you're going to time us. Now, what are we going to, some people say, what the heck am I supposed to be doing here? Well, hopefully you're muted. Good. And what we'd like to do for this 20 minutes is, whatever method you use or how you put your body, you want to lie on the floor, sit yoga, sit in the chair. However, my suggestion is, I'm going to close my eyes, is you try not to pay attention to your thoughts or your plans for the day or how you ache, unless you're just laying and you're thinking about sending me cookies. Then that should be the focus of the 20 minutes. But for everybody else, and just sit and let God do what God wants in the silence and the stillness. I think God can do some of God's. We make it a little bit easier for God. So God doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. So that's what we're going to do. 20. Mary, you take over. I'm going mute.
Okay. And Mary, please lead us in the Our Father when we finish our 20 minutes to bring us more fully back into the room.
All right, I'll ring the bell and then start the Our Father for us.
Okay, thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Okay. Welcome back. Looks like most everybody stayed with us too. That's pretty good. Well, now, are there any, open this up to questions and reflections? You can put something in the chat, or you just unmute yourself and say something. So we'll leave that open here for the moment.
Father, could I say something?
Sure.
I just want to tell you on behalf of our Boulder friends, we think of you often. You come up at coffee just about every single coffee session on Sunday, if nothing else for the fact that we have to have the best cream for Father Terry. So you are in the hearts and minds of all of us in Boulder. And I think this week you're going to get a number of Boulderites on your meeting when you talk about Betsy Seraphin's book. So we miss you, and sorry that I didn't send you a Christmas card. But reflecting on your talk this morning, one of the things that you said right at the beginning to me really resonated, where you're talking about the Holy Family and the role of Saint Joseph. And I just find with God, as a result of learning from you, God puts things in simple terms, but everything is super elegant in all kinds of layers. So we always thought about, well, Jesus really had the relationship with Mary because she was immaculately conceived, or he was immaculately conceived. St. Joseph kind of had a part-time role. And what I was thinking about this morning, not a part-time, that's probably not the right word, but a different type of role, is our life is like that. And, we're raised by our parents, and we have a very close relationship with our mothers because they bore us. But our father is very important, but our true father is really God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And I think that's what often he says to us when he says, you've got to step away from your material parents and really come to me to be, really enter the kingdom of heaven. Did I interpret that correctly?
Well, I think that's along the lines, except I don't know. I would recommend that when you're then living out the relationship, you live it out with the family that you stepped away from. I'll give you an example. Living in the monastery now, let's say I'm part of a family, the monastic community here. But I step away, and we all do step away from one another in a sense of, although we may several of us be sitting in the room together, all sitting in meditation. But we do that so that we can be centered, or allow ourselves to get centered on our source, ultimate reality, the God who energizes us. But then when we get up, the expectation is, at least for me, my experience, the expectation is that I become of service to the others. And I'll give you a way that I think the Holy Spirit, as you mentioned, works in this, at least in me. So it's a bit of a confession. I cook here now, and I didn't used to cook. Uh, and, but it wasn't that I couldn't cook. It's that I had a certain fear about cooking for 9 or 10 people and having to have it ready at a certain moment. That's a lot different than being on holiday with my sister and saying, we'll eat when it's ready, maybe at 4 o'clock, 4:15. There's no pressure. Uh, and it's just cooking for one other person. But here, I took up the cooking in part to be of service to the others because we were short of cooks. It's COVID. We're not bringing in anybody to cook. And the community is our size. Others are either can't or whatever reason don't cook. But if we don't eat together, then there's to me, a certain lack of community because we pray the hours during the day. And one of the sext, S-E-X-T, is something we do before we eat. And known, N-O-N-E, is something we do after we eat and clean up. And if we don't eat our midday meal together, we're going to skip those parts of the Holy Office and skip praying together. And to me, we're beginning to skip being the community we're supposed to be. We're not hermits. So, okay, all this was well and good. I started to cook, but the one thing that was one of the last things for me to let go of is, I guess you'd call them resentments and judgments of others, which goes back to, I think, something I said at the beginning. I got into thinking only about me and saying nobody else is thinking about me. And I don't like that. So why don't they cook? Why are they so lazy? Why don't they learn to cook? You know, I'd have these thoughts, and especially as the cooking wasn't going so well, I'd get resentful. And I wasn't of service so much. I was doing it because, now there's an expectation. I said I was going to cook, the meal be there. But there was kind of a resentment that other people, they're just lazy people. Why don't they cook? Why don't they do something? Yeah, blah, blah. And it went on and on and on. And those things would keep coming up. It was one of the last things to let go of until I suddenly I didn't just realize it, but it took hold of me. This person doesn't cook, but I can take care of this person and cook. And maybe one of the reasons they don't cook is they had the same thing I had, a certain fear that it's not going to turn out all right, which again is just it's all about me. So I think that the prayer brings us to our source, that we are God's family, but then we have to live it out with our own families. And I appreciate what you said about, I don't think people forgot me. I just think everybody's moved on. And in that sense, and so maybe it's nice that people still talk about me at coffee. And one of the reasons, this is for SOS, I'll let you know. This coming Wednesday and then 2 Wednesdays after at 2 o'clock my time, which is 4 o'clock East Coast time, I'm going to begin talking about a woman named Betsy Seraphin, who wrote a book about the 5 petals, referring to, I think she was referring to petals of a rose. And this book is hard to find. The Rose of 5 Petals. And what struck me about Betsy Seraphin is in many ways, she looked like, she's dead now. She died, she had Alzheimer's. But before that, you would see her in church, going to Mass, being with the other people, being in coffee afterwards. She worshipped at the parish that I was working at. I knew her before that years ago when I was at another parish I knew about and would talk with Betsy Seraphin. So to one extent, you could connect your life to hers because she was a wife, a mother, and a grandmother, and worshiper at a Catholic church. But she was a searcher. And I'm very interested in talking. You don't have to be a special, different person. You know, the thing about Jesus, he didn't get married. He was crucified. He was, you know, we refer to him as divine. And which is why I talk so much about his humanity today, because I want to connect him to the way we live our lives, rather than just, well, he was God. So he can do that. I can't do that kind of stuff. But Betsy was a great searcher. And she wasn't so much, it wasn't as if she says, I'm going to leave everything and go search. It's that when she came upon something, she wanted to know about it. But she was centered upon Jesus Christ. Everything came back to understanding better through, say, Zen, Hinduism, therapeutic touch, just all kinds of stuff. Well, she lived in Boulder, which is we often kid one another. Boulder is the center of spiritual things. You know, something's going to happen. Rolfing, it's going to be in Boulder. You know, the one thing, Pilates, I remember I was living in Boulder in ministry. And then the next place I went was Knoxville, Tennessee. Well, Pilates was in Boulder. You don't have to know what it is. But I get to Tennessee and I'm talking to therapists. And I said, do you do Pilates? And they looked at me like I was from the moon. What are you talking about? A couple of years later, they had Pilates. So, but the thing is, we often say Boulder is the place that wants to experience anything new. And what's ever new is the latest thing and the newest thing and the best thing until the next thing comes along. Well, what I liked about Betsy is she never lost a sense of her roots, whatever rootedness. I mean, if your rootedness is Judaism, that's your rootedness. But be willing to look around at what can make you a better Jew instead of just, you know, saying everybody else is wrong, I'm right, and blah, blah, blah. And no, that's not the kingdom of God as far as I know. Remember, Jesus was a Jew. He died a Jew. And he didn't recommend that you go make new religions. He didn't invent Christianity. But he was a searcher. And he was a better Jew because of it. And that's what I think I like, the things I like about Betsy. I don't know if I can do it in 2 sessions. I couldn't do this one in 1 session. So that's my thinking about why I'm going to talk about Betsy Seraphin, who you've never heard of, but hopefully I can connect it very much to your life.
Well, and just a little bit about Betsy, you know, in the book, she talks about meeting the Dalai Lama and some of the messages he had for her in her life of search. And her husband is one of the most famous atmospheric scientists in the world. He was head of the National Center of Atmospheric Research in Boulder, and very smart guy. So together, quite a couple.
There you go.
Father Terry.
Yes.
You mentioned swaddling, and I'd like to share with you something that for me is so special about it. I heard about a doctor who teaches people how to swaddle a baby, because in swaddling them, it brings them great comfort and relief. And so there are some infants that are totally fussy and obviously in distress, and nothing else works, but swaddling will. And that sense of mimicking the embrace of the womb, so that the child is back to something that's familiar, was the concept that's based on. And I'm wondering if the desire for these weighted blankets of today is part of that wanting to be swaddled, wanting to have that sense of something holding your skin, entire body wise. So for me, when they talk about Jesus being swaddled, it's like Jesus being cradled in love. just as you were saying, the need for him to be held, the swaddling clothes is a form of holding.
Yes, but we pretty much lost that until we rediscovered it. And I bet if you asked a lot of people who were looking at Jesus swaddled, they wouldn't have the foggiest notion what it was about, or they wouldn't know what swaddling is. They just know he's wrapped up in bandages, is what it looked like. And the other image. So now we're learning something about the benefits of it. So what we're finding out is people had ancient practices that could be very useful. But the other thing that you see a lot of, and I suspect it's the one in most of the manger scenes, is he's like this with his arms open, looking up. He's got a halo on his head, and we're worshiping him. But my point is, he wanted to be held or swaddled, as you say. And in other words, what happens is, what I think can happen too much in that. Yes, he's God. What can happen too much in that is we worship God, but we don't change. We don't become what God made us to be. And that's so prevalent nowadays. And all the people who call themselves, in my tradition, Catholic or Christian. And they're basically very selfish and self-centered. But they go to church. And they wouldn't call themselves selfish and self-centered any more than I would have called myself selfish and self-centered for years as a worshiping Catholic. Well, where did I find out that I might have been a little more selfish than I thought? I found it out from contemplative practice. I practice, I'm going to tell you. I practiced contemplative prayer because I thought it would make me happy. Because the people I met were happy. Or it would make me smarter so I could be a better teacher and be more the center of attention sometimes. Some of that was there. What I learned was more about my shortcomings and faults and failings. God said, well, before we get anywhere, Terry Ryan, let me tell you what gets in the way. You got to keep at it. You got to keep at it to get beyond, I think, to get beyond your original reasons for doing what you did. You're not a searcher if you're trying to do something to make you feel better. I mean, you do something to make you feel better. That's fine, but don't call it searching. Searching is when you come up against you being the problem and you stay with it. That's when you're going to become more of a wisdom figure, because you'll be able to talk out of your own experience to other people's experience. This is why I think Jesus' parable stories are so powerful, because they come from his experience, not from a book. So many people who teach and preach, you said, oh, where'd they read that? That they're just repeating to me. Oh, there's another. Oh, I remember learning that in the seminary. And so on and so forth. But I think the power comes when you can touch people in the reality of their lives, and it catches them and makes them take another look at themselves. Trouble with the religious leaders, one of the troubles is Jesus says you're hypocrites, and they crucified him. So they stayed hypocrites rather than learn from it. So when God points out to me, Terry, you're a hypocrite. I don't want to hear that. Well, I had to hear it. So I think that you can combine learning. I mean, I do a lot of reading. You can combine reading with the prayer, and then you grow. I mean, Jesus had the scriptures. So he was reading, meditating on the scriptures. So learning has a place, but that place has to then touch your own personal experience. And then I think that combination will really work on you and then work on others. So That's one of the reasons that I read a lot. And matter of fact, I think, let me see if this is the book. I think that Father Damien, when he gave a talk recently, talked about the taste of silence, which we have in our store. Jackie van der Kirchhoff, however you say that. And she was a woman who was pursuing one path of life, found out that she had Lou Gehrig's disease, was going to die within 2 years in misery, and didn't die. But what happened was she's now maybe 40. So for the last 20 years, what she did a lot of was read. So she learned. Learning was a big part of her experience. But then she combined that, because she had such an inactive life in one way, she got into a lot of silence and stillness. So she grew internally, and the reading fed it. So you go back and forth. I found that a lot of the stuff I learned in the seminary wasn't very helpful. But I found a lot of the things that I learned after the seminary were very helpful. So you just sort of pick and choose. I'm always very aware of when someone's talking out of a book and not out of their own personal experience. And I don't mind people talking out of a book, especially if you're talking about the sciences. But I also want to know often, well, what is your experience having read that? What did it do to you? And that's when I think it gets pretty exciting. I remember one of the things I remember when I was listening to a really boring teacher. He was just talking out of a book. But if you could stop him with a question and he got into his own personal experience, boy, I was all ears. I mean, that hour of class time just flew by. So I learned after a while, try to come up with a question. This guy's boring, but he's not boring. His talk is boring because there's not enough of him in it. And when you get him in it, boy, then it just really comes alive and you connect to exactly what he was teaching about, but somehow his experience of it makes it real. And those always, for me, were the best learning moments. So I like to read books in which people are saying, this is what I got out of it, which is the one I just mentioned to you, The Taste of Silence. So I invite you to taste silence.
I would say one of the things that I love most about our talks here and listening to you is when you speak about your internal dialogue. Meditation in silence brings that awareness, I believe. You know, at first, when you're meditating, you might catch yourself saying something you wish you hadn't. And then you start becoming more aware of your own thoughts and you kind of get over yourself. And then sometimes in the deeper silence, you can hear inspiration and thoughts that come that you know that they're not yours because they're beyond yourself. They're either presented in a voice that you don't recognize or just they surprise the daylights out of you. And just by hearing you speak about your thoughts in the kitchen and reprimanding yourself for the egocentric ideas you have just reminds me to do more of that. And so I guess I just want to say I appreciate what's between the lines of these talks that you give.
To change the subject a little bit, at least, one thing that's always made me curious, Jesus's teachings, you know, he was a carpenter, contractor, constructor. There are very few stories about building, about working in wood or construction. And I'd always wondered why. And then I thought about it a little bit, and I wonder if what he was doing was trying to tell stories that related to the other people's experiences. there were probably a few carpenters or people who had the ability or the gift to work with wood or stone or whatever kind of construction materials. But most people at his time were living sort of a hand-to-mouth existence, and they had to work in the fields. They had to plant, they had to harvest, they had to fish. And I wonder if what he was trying to do was not talk about his experiences, but trying to relate it to their experiences.
Well, certainly, once he got to Judea, around Jerusalem, which is built on a hill, not too much fishing going on there. So I think the fishing stories or the fishing experiences, cast your net to this side, trust and hope and have faith and so on, they were very much for the people along the Sea of Galilee who made their living there. And I think his story about building a house on sand versus building a house on rock definitely would pertain to his kind of work that he did. And then in terms of planting and harvesting, there was so much of that going on in the fertile ground of Galilee. And he working in the harvest and being surrounded by fields would help him to see, well, you go out, you plant the grain, and then, it does what it does. You go to sleep, you don't, and all of a sudden it comes up. And he uses that to make a point. So I think a lot of what comes out of meditation, even though you say you're letting go of your thoughts and I say you enter into your silence and stillness, you will, because of your contemplative life, you will connect that to your daily existence, and you'll get certain points, certain wisdoms out of your daily life that you didn't see before. I use the kitchen, for instance, and the cooking, for instance. So that, I think, is part of how you make the connection, that he talks about normal situations or situations that people would see every day, but his point maybe is a little bit different. And so I try to keep that in mind when I'm reading in the scriptures and I see something, oh, wow, that's pretty profound. But the profundity came out of maybe an everyday situation. And his everyday situations was meeting a lot of suffering, because that was what a lot of life, they didn't live very long. I mean, if they lived into their 40s, that was pretty much old age. Well, let's stop with that. This is all recorded, and you can go on to snowmassbookstore.com and give it about a day or so, and you'll be able to see where you can go for this particular talk on YouTube. You don't have to go to YouTube to find it. Go to snowmassbookstore.com. And I think it's also going to have all my other talks all grouped together. We're trying to do that. So I'll be back this coming Wednesday at 2:00 my time, 2:00 Mountain Time, to begin a talk on the spiritual. And it's not just a biography of Betsy Seraphin I'll be talking about. They're trying to make points about her that will help us. So that's the point. So we can grow in our own spiritual life, listening to someone who, for many people, seemed like a very ordinary person. Although she did meet the Dalai Lama. So, okay, take care. And thank you all for coming. Best teaching discussion involves relationship. The worst teachers never reach out to I'm not going to read. I'll read that a little bit later. Okay. Take care, everybody. And keep me in prayer.
Can I add one thing, Father, before we leave?
Yes.
The Seekers of Silence in Knoxville are kind of struggling with the idea about meeting in person or coming online. And we're taking it day by day, which is very mystical of us. But most likely we will be inviting you back next month if you have this time available. And if anybody wants to connect with the Seekers of Silence, you can reach out to Edgar Miller. His email address is edgarmiller25@gmail.com. And we'll try to keep you up to date and add you to our list so that we can notify you when we will be having another speaker. But most likely it'll be you, Father Terry, in February.
Okay, just let me know.
Thank you. You're so gracious.
It'll be the
Appreciate
first
you.
Saturday of February.
It's the first Saturday of
We'll
February.
see. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Father Terry, thank you.